Ferdinand Marcos Jr. is projected to win the presidential election in the Philippines by a landslide. Nearly 36 years ago, a people's revolt ousted his father, Ferdinand Marcos, from power. And now, after yesterday's election, it appears Marcos Jr. holds more than double the amount of votes of his closest opponent. So Liz Palmer has been following this story for us and is here to discuss. Liz, anyone who knows the history of the Marcoses in the Philippines will be flabbergasted at this turn of events if you haven't been paying attention, which I have not. What I learned since, though, is that Marcos Jr. has actually been in politics for a while in the Philippines. So who is he?
Well, he is the son of probably the most famous and maybe infamous dynasty in Philippine politics. His mother is Imelda Marcos, who was the First Lady of the Philippines and famously had many thousands of pairs of shoes, which were discovered by angry crowds who overran the palace in 1986 and forced the Marcoses not only out of power, but to leave the country. Ferdinand Marcos Sr. died 3 years later at the end of the 80s. And the family was determined to come back to the Philippines. They did manage to return, and they have since been very carefully reconstructing their credibility. Imelda Marcos is still very influential. She plays the role of philanthropist, so she has been helping her son regain political influence, first as a senator, then as a high-profile candidate, although he lost, for vice president 6 years ago. And now, as you said, it looks as if he's going to be an absolute slam dunk for the president of the Philippines.
So the question is, how was he able to, in a way, rewrite history for, people in the Philippines? I mean, we all remember that the Marcoses left the country with suitcases full of cash. It's alleged anyways. They are accused of taking billions of dollars from the country, but somehow they've managed to sort of romanticize that era.
They have indeed. You put your finger on it when you said remember. Actually, the Philippines is a young country, and a lot of young people don't remember that era of gross human rights abuses, of martial law. Analysts say that it was a really careful and large effort to control the message through social media that managed, and it began long before the campaign, but certainly picked up steam before the campaign, it managed to convince people that far from being an era of epic corruption and gross abuse, Ferdinand Marcos's period in power was actually a golden era of stability and security. And by implication, his son would bring that back. Unbelievably, to critics, it seems to have worked because he has won with more than double the number of votes of his main opponent, who is the outgoing vice president, a human rights lawyer. And
just to add a cherry on top, his running mate is Sara Duterte. People will know that last name as well.
Well, sure, people will know it because Rodrigo Duterte is the current president of the Philippines. He will be until Bongbong Marcos is inaugurated at the end of June. He's infamous for having declared war on gangs and drugs and ordered, allegedly, the extrajudicial killings of drug dealers. He's a strongman leader. His daughter is the running mate of Marcos, so she will now be the vice president of the Philippines. You might say that Bongbong Marcos is a strongman in the mold of his father, and you could say that Sara Duterte is a strong woman leader, if there is such a thing. She's a lawyer too by training, and she's a tough nut. She has been the mayor of one of the largest cities in the Philippines, Davao, and she's famous for for having smacked publicly a sheriff of the city when he went up against her in a question of some slum clearances. So she's a tough cookie. But I think crucially you need to think of her as the daughter of a political dynasty, having joined forces with the son of another political dynasty. They are going to wield tremendous power. And analysts, particularly critical ones, say that we could be witnessing the return of an era of corruption and the kind of crony politics that we saw under Ferdinand Marcos Sr. back in the 80s.
Wow. It is remarkable. If you wrote it as a movie script, people would say it's not believable enough. Really something. Liz, thank you very much.